Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the City Futures seminar series. Very pleased today we've got a guest speaker joining us, Professor Paolo Boccagni, and the topic of today's seminar is the concept of home. So it's appropriate to acknowledge that we're joining you today from the home and the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. And we'd like to pay our respects to elders past and present. And if you're joining us online, you might want to share in the chat whose lands you're joining us from today. Professor Paolo Boccagni is a professor of sociology at the University of Trento. We're very lucky to have him join us. He was visiting Melbourne for a conference and dropped me a line and said, "Hey, would you like a visitor?" And I said, "Yes, please. We would very much like you to present to our seminar series." Paolo and I first met back in 2018 in Uppsala in Sweden, where we were attending a conference and where he was undertaking interviews for his project on homing. And Paolo is really an expert on the concept of home, and I'm very excited to have him come and talk to us today about experiences of home amongst asylum seekers. I'll let him do the talking on that topic, so I'll hand over to him shortly. Just before I do, just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you joining us online. During the presentation, please keep your microphones and your cameras off. And then after the presentation, when we come to question time, it would be great if you could turn your camera and your microphone on to ask your questions. You can also pop questions in the chat and Richard will read those out to us if you would prefer. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Paolo.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon to people in presence and online. Well, Professor Easthorpe very kindly accepted the self-invitation here. I can also have a number of topics that could speak to an Australian audience as much to a European one. I think when it comes to home and starting from empirical research. And I thought of this presentation as a way to discuss the meaning of implications of home through the lived experience of asylum seekers in waiting, in context of dwelling between strangers, and in context where the interaction between the material side, the built environment where one is, and the emotional and moral relational side of home is not that clear. So there are a number of interesting things there. I think that can speak to a broader audience across countries, disciplinary backgrounds and areas of interest. So both home and homemaking are important points in the literature on asylum seekers, displaced migrants, and refugees. However, to my knowledge, relatively little of that literature addresses the inner experience of that. So explores how home, the struggle, or the lack of it is negotiated from within the spaces where people are held, or at least in the better case, hosted in waiting when their applications for asylum are assessed. Along these lines, I'll visit an ethnography I did over the past 4 years within one asylum section in Italy. The question being, what does home and the struggle, the negotiation for it means in a place where people are hosted but are not expected or supposed to make themselves at home in any way. What the implications are for the very meaning and the accessibility of home for asylum seekers and refugees more broadly, and more theoretically speaking, for the interface between home and house, between the set of emotions and relations we tend to associate with the notion of a home and the materiality of the built environment in which people happen to stay. In addressing this, I'll pick up ideas which I collected over the last few years. First, at a first theoretical level, and then at a more empirical one. What I'd like to do here is to delve further into the empirical material I accumulated in this ethnographic effort, on which I published some preliminary paper, and I'm about to work on a book project right now. So I very much welcome any feedback and criticism with a view to move forward to this. These are ideally the variety of topics I'd like to touch, at least briefly, starting from a theoretical incursion into the home literature and on the particular background of my case study about asylum reception in Italy, to then enter one particular asylum center, the one in which I was lucky to have access as an ethnographer, to see how dynamics of home and non-home are played out there. And as a last step, getting back to a more theoretical level on what these particular case studies suggest on the interplay between home and house, and homemaking more in general. Now, my proposal for a number of colleagues that have published on over the last couple of decades is to approach this notion looking both at the role of special places that matter more than others for a number of reasons, and to the ways in which people place themselves there. In terms, in particular, would suggest of also relationship that have to do with the people's ways of trying to attach a sense of security, familiarity, and control over place. This is a topical research question, arguably, I would say, for most of us, but most visibly and most contentiously for asylum seekers, as long they are, by definition, people pushed away, expelled from whatever used to be home for them, and are in a position to have to navigate, to search for it anymore. The thing, however, is what happens while people are waiting. A typical aspect of forced migration flows relative to whichever other category of migrants has to do with the significance of temporality in terms of finding themselves for more or less protracted time in a position of neither here nor there. They may have reached a place in a way or another, but they may not be entitled to stay there for good unless their cases are assessed, with a number of forms of exclusion and marginalization these may entail in practice. So the question here is, what does home mean, and how far can it be enacted if at all in the meanwhile? So in an existential terrain that is temporary by definition. Now, this to me can also be fruitfully be revisited on the terms of the debate between on the interplays between home and a house, going beyond the most obvious statements that the whole home and even the home is not a house, that there is much more there, but still leaving aside a number of things, and leaving aside the fact that even a house, whichever house, holds a number of meanings, memories, and histories embedded in it that are important in themselves. But even aside for that, the point is what if we move from a traditional, I guess, common sense understanding of house versus home? So we have one thing, one entity on one side and one entity on the other, to an understanding of the mutual interplay between house and home, with the mutual interdependence between the relational affective side and the material infrastructure one, particularly in the case of asylum seekers. Now, a very quick and cursory institutional background when it comes to asylum seekers in Mediterranean countries like Italy. To put it bluntly, the bulk of forced migration to Italy and actually to Europe at large comes through undocumented channels. Most often, but not only, through the Mediterranean corridors from North Africa and from Eastern Europe, which, by the way, resulted in the Mediterranean being, over the last 2 decades, the most dangerous sea all over the world, if it is assessed by the number of people dying along the way. What happens, though, is that at some point people make it to Europe. When it comes to Italy, they are entitled, if they apply for asylum, they are entitled to some sort of basic hospitality while their cases are assessed, even so, while being a hyper-visible minority of people, they are still a tiny fraction of the whole population of immigrants in the country. My research was done in one among hundreds of or thousands of reception centers that have been set up in the country over the last decade, more than before, as a result of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. Here, when it comes to emergency housing for asylum seekers, there are a number of commonalities across asylum centers in Europe. Part of them, at least, having some overlap with the global issue on camps on a world level. These places are typically obsolete pre-existing infrastructures that are adapted for this kind of dwellers, so which only typically gives a message about them. They are places of surveillance, of control, as much as of irrelevance. People can stay there as long as they are not too visible in a way. They are places in which people stay, but where the chance for a better life at some point have very much to do not just with staying, but with the ability and the support in reaching out, in looking for jobs, for contacts, for forms of social capital that may give people more likelihood of moving forward over time. Having said that the key step has to do with the adjudication of the legal status, which is actually at some point may well be positive. It is not necessarily a matter of failure. Now, a number of topics can be discussed from within this lived environment, and intriguing, if paradoxical one, is what happens in a place where people say that nothing happens. How is it that people struggle and sometimes are successful in filling up a space-time that by definition is empty? It has to do with an institutionalized condition of waiting, which in practice may be a matter of years and years within the same place. So this is just by way of a picture, the particular place in which I was lucky enough to have access as an ethnographer for 4 years. The people I'm talking about are white, are black males in their early 20s, most of them from the west of Africa. Among other things, I tried to make sense there of how the interplay between home and house is lived within this particular place. This is a shelter, so a place like so many more with a very basic and essential place way of domesticity. People are hosted there. They are typically isolated from the outer city. They are subject to some form of control, to some form of infantilization. At the same time, as in any lived environment with the people in, stay there over time takes a rhythm, a routine, a sort of endogenous order of its all right. It's almost as a place of normality of its own. It's kind of like a bubble which, relative to the outer reality, isolates people, but also gives them some protection, some sense of being less out of place, perhaps less specialized or discriminated than in the other urban world around them. However, the point is that while people are there, they may dream to be wherever else, they may just be waiting for their case to be assessed and so forth, but still things happen. Things that can be decoded in terms of interplay between the built environment and the dweller, how the configuration of the built environment shapes people routines, and how people routines shape in some way the built environment in turn. It can be read in terms of a dynamic of host and guest, as well as of a number of emotions, relationships and practices that, at least at an analytical level, if not at a practical one, can be framed in terms of home making, as I'll try to argue in a little more while. Now, the very notion of home takes up different meanings for the different categories of people within an asylum reception center. For the average staff member, case workers, porters, and so on, home is for them something that lies elsewhere. This is only a place to work, a matter of working shifts, and yet, interestingly enough, there is a dynamic of hospitality there, whereby some of the domestic repertoire of meanings of expectation is translated, enacted, and forced into this place too. The typical argument, kind of patronizing ways of approaching to young asylum seekers as guests is, you should do things here in a certain way because we all do things this way in our place. Because a good domestic place should be based on care for it, on cleaning, on not consuming too much power, and so on and so forth. So there is an expectation of isomorphic domesticity, as it were, that deletes or try to delete the obvious inequalities of in power positions and so forth between the staff and people in. The typical argument would be, you are staying in this place. It's a kind of a home for you, so why don't you take some more care about it? There is the repertoire of the good domestic space to be taken care of, which is very weird within a place that nobody, as a guest, as a young male West African asylum seeker, has particular reason to feel to call home at all. And by the way, I realized through this that a apparently silly, irrelevant, but actually very interesting topic across the literature on home in practice, which is not so much discussed in the literature as it would deserve in my view, is just simple cleaning. Who is responsible to take care of a domestic space? What this entails in practice on a number of levels, just as a point which I very quickly touch. Now, nobody in this place would ever call it a home. Everybody is typically tends to complain because as a resident there, you have to shift to the times when you can go in and out. You're not allowed to invite their friends or even less women. You have a number of rules and blah, 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 blah. All and most importantly, as a guest in a place for asylum seeker, you, as a young male West African migrant, you are kind of feminized. You feel within a role, a social position that does not match the gendered expectations for adulthood, for becoming real man, as it were, for becoming adult and autonomous people as a result of migration. So there are a number of important tensions at play there. As long as people use the word at home, as I will try to show now, there is a descriptive level. I'm going back to the place where I'm staying, where I'm hosted, where I have my birthplace. But there is a more identity-based level, which has all to do less with the asylum center as such than with the country, the continent, the life one comes from. So fundamentally with Africa. With a number of tensions, once again, as soon as people talk about home, which is typically a complex, intimate matter that emerges only in particular moment of trust relationships with them, where the conversation gets deeper, when people are in the mood for discussing such intimate things, the argument is home is where I come from. So a very ascriptive and identity-based sense of home, even while one has been deprived of it. Home cannot be displaced because in this place, in an asylum center, I am not in control of anything. So here we have a gendered understanding of home as the place where I am empowered, if any place like that exists. There is also, more interestingly, in my view, what I would frame as an existential sense of home as the place where I ultimately belong and where I will have to go back at some point. In the very poignant, to me, statement that a Ghanaian migrant in his 40s shared with me, I can live here. It makes sense. It is still a place, a country where I can hope to gain better lives, to send money back, and so on and so forth. I cannot die here because it is not natural to die out of the place where one comes from, where the ancestors come from, where one's ultimate home as village belong. And yet, home to some extent is not only a matter of remote from them in space and time. I discussed this most richly with one of my key participants, who already was kind enough to give me materials, ideas for a number of articles, to which I will need to find ways to return and to give back in some way. Now, the argument is, if I start from a descriptive level, home is the place where I am staying right now, the place where my bed is. But here, more complexities start. There is a place in which I do have some control, some sense of intimacy, at least as long as I'm entitled to stay. However, at the same time, home is where I come from. Because there is an identity side, there is a wealth, a legacy of one's parenting, family, kinship, and past life that is not going to be questioned even in circumstances of forced migration, where it often happens that family ties were disrupted for a number of reasons, possibly for violent episodes, for forms of what someone would call domicile, so the literal destruction of the house one came from, and so on and so forth. The point here, there is still a tension between the bad place, the very intimate space around my body, which is a way I can call home, instrumentally at least, and the source of identification of selectively good memories of belonging that is only in the country where I come from. At the same time, I asked Olozora, as I'm calling him, a possibly naive and yet I think heuristically good question at some point of our conversation that lasted for hours and hours and hours. The question is, well, if I am staying in your bedroom in the center now, how can I say that it is your room and not the room of this guy, of that guy, of that guy, and so on and so forth? Olozora smiled and looked at me and thought, have you ever noticed this thing? This is my black rucksack. It was a present from a girlfriend. I may carry it on wherever, as long as I have it, I kind of feel in a partially different space than usual. So, having said of the importance of the infrastructure side of a place to be in the first place, there is also a symbolic way of reproducing some sense of home also through portable objects for a number of purposes. Less for what the objects are, a rucksack is one among million rucksacks, than for what the object does. For the memories and attachments it can be over people's life course, particularly if people are highly mobile for all sorts of reasons and constraints. Now, an important, a very delicate but important field to explore the meanings of home has to do with people's own bedrooms. This particular center, by the way, was relatively rich, as it were, one for an Italian standard. People were hosted in rooms with 2 beds each, so they did have some degree of control, of ability to rest, to have their own space within these rooms. It is still an heteronymous form of domesticity. Any staff member can get in any time if there is a need for that, but still there was something there. However, that something there had, and interestingly, again, for the discussion of home, both a positive side, as it were, a source of some more protection, privacy, and inclusion, and a more problematic side. Because as long as I'm staying here, as long as I'm staying in my own room, as long as I have no contacts, friends, opportunities, chances to get a job, and so forth, I risk, the more I stay there, to get lost in my own bad thoughts, in the memories of the traumatic past that looms over my life. Even in the inverted commas best case, all of these people have risked their lives at least once, coming through the Mediterranean by boat, and possibly more than that. So there is a tension between the possibility, even the basic hospitality of staying in a bedroom, and the fact that only by reaching out, only by finding more opportunities, some sort of basic job, some relational networks of their own, outside they will be able to make their home way, so to make themselves really at home or long term by becoming autonomous in the first place. So there are different forms of homemaking that strive with each other within one and the same place. There are forms of literal homemaking that have to do with the need for people to need or task or obligation actually for people to take care of the place, to cook there, to contribute to cleaning shifts, and so on and so forth. However, there were, and interestingly to me, even in apparently very mundane, banal things as cleaning, different ways of making sense of it that go all around the span between a top-down duty you have to do, unless you will be kicked out of this place, and in some cases, for some people, the need to take care of cleaning in what I would see as an almost obsessive way, because this is something that even as an asylum seeker with no certainty, no money, no nothing, you are in a position to do as a form of control of what one might call self-respect and dignification. So within the same very simple and prosaic sets of practices, so many more things can be seen once one approaches them from the inside out. Now, there were also, as interestingly to me, forms of homemaking that are not so little, but involve sometimes, in the best times when there is more money to support people, attempts to what some of the literature has called beautification, to take care of the material infrastructure side of the place in more than instrumental ways, to make the place a little more nice, to have more space for a TV, for people to share time there, to make things, maybe to cultivate something in the orchard around, to do a number of small things that make no practical difference, but that might help people to feel a little bit better there. In practice, this is a contentious and contradictory set of ways of making space better. It stands because the ways in which the staff, so the native guest worker, would like to make the place better are not necessarily the same as the guest would like to. And each guest, in turn, has their own ways of improving a little bit the inner space, which may have to do with decorating place, with carving out some space to listen music, to have prayers, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing for me here is that while a number of people do, over time, have their own ways of what I would call homemaking, so to try to carve out, even within a collective life environment, some space, some time that is more pleasant, more rewarding, more consistent with one's lifestyle, this is typically a contentious effort. This is, to some extent, a zero-sum game, because many people living within the same space cannot necessarily be accommodated in terms of their needs and practices. So there is a very important side to me in acknowledging the relevance of minor, simple forms of homemaking, but this is an embattled field of practices as much as any other. As important to me is to work through a paradox. Nobody, no resident in an asylum center would ever call that place a home. There is something to this which, with some colleagues, I have tried to phrase as no home. So the point is, it's not that people are homeless, but rather they actively decide not to accept the place where they are staying as a home, because it doesn't meet any of the standards and expectations. At the same time, there is temporality at play, which means that if I happen to stay for all sorts of reasons in the same built environment, in the same very space for years and years, I may see it as a disgusting one, but still something happens. I'm likely, whether I acknowledge it or not, to develop a number of routines or ways of appropriating it to some extent of taking somehow care of it that have to do with some form of reluctant homemaking, as it were. Having said that the more important things will still happen outside in relation to the adjudication of the asylum case and of searching for a job and so on, there is something important there. Even once people are out of the center, because any perception project is a temporary by definition, the effort to find new places to be is there. It's important, although the bulk of critical things for their future life has very much to do with the status, with getting or not a legal status, if they will eventually be rejected as asylum applicants. They are very unlikely to be deported, in Italy at least, but still things will be still more complex. As critical is to find some sort of a job, at least in an informal labor market. Now, looking at the future dimension of home, as it were, the question is, what about the future can people see from this present of stillness, of being waiting in the here and now? This future is a fascinating one. It articulates a degree of fascination with the more modern, as it were, lifestyle than the one accessible to the bulk of people in the countries of origin, wherever they may be. But more important, it articulates a need for normality, what I would call normality. In the sense to the bulk of people I talk with, the question was, I would like just at some point to have a job, a family, a wife, a child, and so on. The most, as it were, boring and ordinary views of the future ever that are most important and striking for people who are deprived for the time being of any chance to get them. Now, wrapping up a little bit because time is running fast, there are different ways to understand, to use the very notion of home making. I thought of at least 4 different meanings that are important here. The key understanding of homemaking as a set of processes whereby people and anybody strives to make themselves a little more at home have to do with the unequal ability and opportunity to nourish some sense of attachment, of presence in the context where people are. This is not a matter simply of affect, of emotion in themselves, but of having or not, negotiating or not a space, an acceptable space for being there, for having some sense of the future where they are. Which again interrogates the relation between house and home in many levels, I think. One argument is perhaps all too obvious. There has been an an inclination, I suspect, in discussing questions of home over the last decade, in particular to go even to this embedded from the materiality of the place where people stay or not, whether they are entitled or not to stay. There is a question of embedding this goes back to a ground of opportunities and rights or of exclusion from them, which leads, I guess, to work more again on not on the distinction between home and house, which is all to us, but on the interdependence between the two notions in three key respects. First, we may wish to say that home is so much more than house, blah, 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 but still, all that has to do with the claims for home, whenever one does not have a decent one, have primarily to do with the materiality of a dwelling infrastructure, if not a house. The very idea of domicile is primarily based on the forms of literal destruction of the house. And the very moral power of home as a category, as an idea, ultimately does rely on some form of access in a bounded and protected space of exclusion from it. In the second place, it's important to empirically trace how far, for different kind of users, a built environment, a domestic environment, has a potential to be constructed, to be perceived as a home, at least for the time being. There is a very subjective, intimate, biographical side to all that has to do with home, but there is still the interdependence with the existence of at least sufficiently good infrastructure conditions out there. I may feel myself as a migrant in whichever different place, but as long as I'm staying in a particular place, I need a basic level of kind of housing quality to be in a position to have some sense of home there. Last, the very notion of home needs to be based more on some sort of built environment in which people are staying. Whichever, again, we can discuss so more as many colleagues have a breakdown of the scarcity of home, on the emotional level, but there is still a need for some materiality, some relatively exclusive, appropriate kind of materiality to bring on, which again leads to the emphasis on the interdependence between home and house, even more so for people in marginalized conditions such as asylum seeker. Very last point, whichever domestic or housing setting is not the last word, it's important to approach people's housing pathways of inclusion and exclusion over time, and the very notion of home, particularly for migrants, but not for them only, I guess, can be seen as an ongoing struggle to trans over time to be more or less far away from something that is perceived as good, decent enough to be framed as a home. So as a matter not just of practices of homemaking, but also of homing as a long life need to tend toward something better, as a train of needs, rights, and pathways of exclusion and hopefully of inclusion over time that pass through the interplay between house and home. I prefer to discuss it. Sorry for being a bit too long.
Thank you very much. So you were just on time. We've got 15 minutes left for questions. Are there any questions online?
Not yet, but while people are thinking, I've actually got a question, if it's all right. I just wanted to thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting talk. But also I wanted to thank you because this is obviously it is like a very personal topic in that it's talking about people in a situation of vulnerability where they have a lack of control and they are in a situation of nervousness where they're not sure of their outcome, and for many years there's a judgment hanging over them which will shape their lives. And I think that it's, I mean, here we are sitting here comfortably and we're going to have a nice weekend after this and we're discussing it in the comfort of a secure environment. But we've got to be aware that this is like a sort of nervous sort of topic, as it were. We're talking about vulnerable people. And so I thank you for the research that are looking into this. It's very important. I wondered about, I don't know how quite that these work, but in Australia we often have asylum detention centres. And detention is often used in the context of prisons and things. So I wondered, do you think policymakers deliberately make it miserable to live there as a deterrent to stop people wanting to immigrate? And whether there would be some possibility that instead it could become like a cultural educational thing that prepares people to go into the community after. And so instead of becoming like a prison, it becomes more like a student accommodation, as it were, so that people also have that degree of control. It's not a judgment hanging over them. They can pass courses on cultural whatever, and that can be part of their application to show they're going to be wonderful people in the community afterwards. Just to give back some of that sense of control. So you're not like a death row inmate just waiting to be told if you're going to be executed.
Can I start? Okay. So thanks very much both for the comments and for these questions. Now, on this question, I need to tread very lightly on the Australian case, because I know little of this. Much of what I know, I confess, and for not for me only, I guess, but for a number of colleagues and public opinion in Europe, has to do with the beautiful book, which you probably know, No Plans but the Mountains by Prof Boccagni, which talks to a very tough and particular context, on which I'm not in a position to say much more than what the powerful witness I read in that particular book. Now, when it comes to Europe, the bulk of the distinction between strictly detention center and sort of hospitality center with some degree of control, but not so much, is also a matter of geography. Because if, which is very unlikely, but if I ever had the opportunity to do the same kind of study on what is actually the external border of Europe, so the externalized controls of flows in Libya, in Turkey, and so forth, I would have come with a quite different picture. The question there is in Australia, as much for Europe and wherever else, to work on the externalization, on pushing further and further and further the externalization of controls for asylum seekers, for a rationale of deterrence, as you were rightly pointing out. The institutional assumption is bad conditions that will discourage people to try it again, which is empirically false, but still there is some inner commitment there, but also for an equally important reason, which has all to do with the invisibility. As long as people that try their way are not too visible, as long as they are literally out of the soil of Europe. So the right legislation of Europe does not apply and not visible to the public opinion. Certain things can be done. Once they are physically with their feet in, it is not the same thing, because there is some more space to play for rights, and because fortunately there is a degree of visibility in the public domain that opens up more terrain for placemaking, from networking, advocacy, affection, and so forth. So I think the question here is how geography plays out. Even in Italy and anywhere else for that matter, the quality of housing for asylum seekers is very unequal through the country for a number of reasons. But the point is, in a way, making it to the territory does make a difference on the continuum between simple prison and some sort of still marginalized, but for accommodation that can still open up for something more and better over time. Thank you.
You go past your hand, that was before mine. So.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. Maybe my question's the same as Ali's because it relates somewhat to her research. I was really interested on one of the slides you were talking about how people were putting out rugs and playing games and, in a sense, claiming space, and that there was some competition over the claiming of space and, I guess, homing in little parts of the space. That's fascinating in terms of, you know, competition within a space to make it home. Did you notice, do you have any reflections on how that was managed within the asylum seek centre? I mean, for example, did particular people claim particular spaces at particular times of day? Was there some kind of spoken or unspoken arrangement around that?
Yes. Thanks, Hazel. The typical pragmatic arrangement was you are entitled to use a space for some time, according to certain periods or whatever else, as long as you don't expect to get settled there. As long as an empty room can be used as a sort of part-time mosque, as it were, for people 5 times a day to have their rights to prayer, but as long as it stays empty the rest of the time. Because if not so, it would go against, it would be a form of acknowledgement, of recognition of some that would be at odds with others. So there is always a mediation between the interests and needs of different parties according to belief, but to very practical things of religion, food, music, and so on and so forth. The only way for different ways of homemaking not to collide with each other is distributing them in time and not accepted from the staff point of view them as forms of appropriation, as it were, of space, as it were, form a territory of its own. However, another interesting thing to me, and more discomforting one perhaps, is that actually the more time, the longer one stays in, if someone, as a part of the people I spoke with, do over time find some job, some minimal source of income, they have less and less reason to stay in a common space at all, because they can afford their own TV, their own PC, their own most things, and they will get closer and they will locked up in their own rooms as far as they can, and they have no reason to care for the others. So in a way, the critical point is that the attempts to make some sociability for people in a common space, in a courtyard, whatever, are attractive to some extent only to those who cannot afford anything more than that, because they can find no job, because they may have mental health issues, because they struggle to stay with the rest. All this being said, COVID came and the public space was just erased there as anywhere else.
I have 2 questions. The first question is, did you notice that there was, say, not an exact time, but a period of time someone would start to feel more at home? Like, was there a period of months, like, that they would start to, you know, feel more at home in the space, or did it happen over an extended period of time? Like, kind of what was the, I'm sure there's not an exact science on it, but Yeah, did you notice at all that there was like a time period where people started to feel more comfortable?
Right. Here, there is, was it the whole question, or there was more?
That was the first one. Question, so, yeah.
There is a whole bunch of literature that associates empirically any positive sense of home with time. The longer time one spends in a place, the more likely he or she is to have some sort of home there. Here the question is a bit more tricky because time clearly makes a difference on familiarity, on predictability of place, of what they can do around, what I know can navigate, what I know I can try and ask case workers, and what there is no point for me to ask, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I suspect that feeling at home also in terms of attachment, of security, had to do less with staying in the asylum center as such than with the highly unequal ability, possibility, opportunity to reach out, to have friends around, to have places to hang out, to have some sort of job. Because at that point, you feel much more in mastery, to some extent at least, over the more difficult case was actually of those who did start with lots of energy. I try to search for a job, I do volunteering, I do internship, blah, 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 and end up maybe 2 or 3 years with no job, with no improvement. At that point, time does not make a difference in a positive, but in a negative sense, because people may have a sense, in their own views. I've tried my best, but I have nothing yet. My friends have made it, I didn't. Why? So the point is, home, and in this sense, I kind of move to a different argument, has to do with the access of a bad space, of a place for oneself, as much as with the ability to navigate the surrounding urban world. If I have, for some reason, over time, some native friend who can help me to find a job, who will tell to the average native citizen that I'm a good guy and not the bad, the black guy who blah, 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 this will help me more than just staying here.
Thank you. That's very good. My second question is, it kind of, you touched upon it briefly, which is, I guess, the opposite of what I thought. You talked about people who'd stayed longer, who got a job, they'd isolate themselves more. My question was, did you notice that people who perhaps have been living in these centres longer, like there was a power dynamic between those who'd been living in longer and those who'd been living in their shorter periods of time, like in terms of, say, bouncing off Hazel's question, like occupying space. Like did those kind of, I've been here longer, or I know this space better than you, like did those power dynamics come up?
That's the next question. There was a power dynamic in terms of the clear difference. I was lucky enough over the years to be trustworthy enough with the numbers of people to be hosted in their rooms, just to stay there and chat or listen to music or PlayStation or do nothing. And the clear point is that there is a difference of power as long as people who do get some small job are in a position to consume more, to have their own TV set in their rooms. So no need to go to the public room as long as there is one. They can afford more sneakers, more objects that make some difference to them, relative to those who have no job, no money whatsoever. And keeping in mind the fact that both the ones and the others have some tacit more obligation to send back money to Africa as soon as possible. So there is also this side. I was about to say something else, but in a way, what was I about to say? Power. Right. There is power. I mean, temporality plays out in different ways. In a way, those who happen to stay once right to stay in a similar place has all to do with the processing of the application for asylum. The bulk of people get rejected at the first step, then appeal against that, and at the second or even sometimes at the third turn, maybe half of them do get some form of humanitarian protection or visa of sort. The thing is, the whole process may take between 2 or 4, even 5 years. The thing is, over a certain threshold, staying there does not at all mean staying better. It just means I have been unable, I've been not lucky enough to find something better out of this place. To find someone who takes me for a job in agriculture, in cleaning, in catering to restaurants, and so on. And I suppose that, I mean, the point is, this place protects me in the first place, but the longer I stay here, the longer it segregates me from the other world. What I typically found was that a number of people who had been there for even 4 to 5 years were not necessarily the well-to-do ones. There were those who struggled. Well, I mean, there may be different reasons. Someone may do his own tactics and think, as long as they don't kick me out, I'm not spending for housing. I have no reason to go out on my own. But to the back of them, the point was, this place is so awful that I want to have my own life, to be free to do whatever, and I search for something else. If people within 3 or 4 years have not been successful in that, this is not a good sign for them.
Thank you.
So it's 5 o'clock. Do we have any unanswered questions online?
There's no online. Oh, no, there's no. Oh, wait. Yes, I was just responding. They said, yeah, thank you, Professor, for the presentation.
Yeah. Homing as a practice is informed innately with a sense of belonging. All the visuals rightly show otherwise. In your research, did you come across any space that felt like it has been homed in some sense by the asylum seeker in a real sense?
Real sense. I came across a number of micro spaces and times which people would not call home, but whose experience sounds with the analytics I would use for home. So time spaces that are more secure, intimate, and comfortable than the rest. This has typically to do with the micro bubbles for someone when he, in this case, prays, for someone when he has a good lunch with certain African foods with the people like him, for someone moments of sociability. For as important was, at least before COVID came, the possibility to host friends there during the day for a while, because shifting even only for a couple of hours from the position of guest to the position of host creates something closer to a sense of inclusive home for people who enact there. Besides this constellation, this unequal constellation of bubble, the precondition for people to make themselves at home in a more durable way is, as they would put it, getting papers and getting jobs, which is not necessarily impossible. It does occur over time, but it takes quite a number of years. It works for some and not for others, and it is not fully predictable from the here and now. People can struggle their best to find their jobs. They can tell themselves they are struggling the best, but more fundamentally, there is a tension between different times. There is the time of urgency, I am here as an asylum seeker. I need to get a job as soon as possible because in this way I am independent. I stand home. I am on my own. And the very empirical objectives say that for questions of human, social, cultural, and educational capital, you would need to invest a little bit, at least, in language, in vocational courses, and so on, to make your position a bit stronger. Having said of all all discrimination against you, if you don't have a basic mastery in the language of the place you are staying, you are very unlikely to find a job. So there is a tension between the desired accelerated time of doing something urgent, and the need to wait to some extent also to go to school, to invest in vocational training, which has a longer time horizon than the horizon of urgency and need for money. People navigate their ways between these two different times. Some are effective in adjusting to the longer time, some are not, and struggle even more along the way.
Thank you. Yeah, I think
Please join me in thanking Paolo. Do we have an announcement on the next